Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Masters of Science in Designing Instructional and Educational Technology, presenting the power of intentional design. We're going to talk about the curb cut effect, the power of choice, creating learning opportunities for multimodal options, and choosing tools. My normal role is that of the Academic Program Director for the National University MS Diet Program. My esteemed colleagues on this panel can introduce themselves. Dr. Amy Peterson.
Hi, everyone. Amy Peterson. I am an adjunct faculty at National University, and I also have about 20 years of experience designing online and hybrid courses.
Thank you. And Dr. Cassandra Kelley.
Hi there, I am Cassandra Kelley, and my background's in K-12 education, and then I also am an adjunct with National University, and I work in teacher preparation. So I'm excited to work with you today.
Excellent. Thank you both. All right, and both of them will be leading different parts of this panel. So today's fun-filled webinar is intended to share some key ideas and frameworks behind adopting a designer's accessibility mindset. We stand on the central premise that accessible design is just good design. Looking ahead, after we're done sharing ideas, we will open it up for general discussion, and you can always type something into the chat. I sincerely thank you all for spending your valuable time with us here today. And to kick it off, there's not good control. There we go. As an advanced organizer for everyone, here are the 3 themes to keep in mind as the slide deck unfolds before your eyes. First theme is accessibility. The second is the power of choice. And the third is adaptation is not replication. Now, you've probably heard a lot lately about social emotional learning, social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are all essential factors to consider when addressing learner needs. I'm going to take a few minutes to explore how accessibility supports all of those goals and more, because accessibility is good design. But before we dive in, a point of lexiconographical clarification. When we say multimodal, we are primarily referring to the use of on-site, online, and hybrid modalities, rather than the multimodal definition that learners can benefit from media-rich content. Both are important concepts to our discussion. Additionally, when we refer to good design, what we mean is design that helps learners learn. So let's dive in with the curb cut effect. But I turned the page too soon. So what is the curb cut effect? The so-called curb cut effect is an early example of how an initiative rooted in physical, literally concrete accessibility shaped our world and resulted in many unintended benefits. The term the curb cut effect is now virtually synonymous with the idea that accessibility design offers an overall net gain and is just considered good design. I was going to have somebody read the slide aloud, but I think I'm going to have to pick on Janine. Would you please read this slide aloud?
Yes, absolutely. So the curb cut effect refers to the fact that designs created to benefit people with disabilities often end up benefiting a much larger user group. So while curb cuts are used by all kinds of pedestrians, meaning curb cuts, as you see in the picture, they were originally created for the sole purpose of allowing people in wheelchairs just to cross the road.
Thank you, Janine. That was wonderful. Can anyone, and use the chat for this, suggest folks who are not in wheelchairs that could benefit from a curb cut? Please post your ideas to the chat. Who else could possibly benefit from a curb cut? I'm seeing strollers. That's the #1 answer. Yeah, exactly. Strollers is great. Kind of like mini wheelchairs.
Mm-hmm.
Visually impaired. Okay, good. Blind people. Excellent. Elderly who has trouble getting upstairs. Good. Boarders. I'm assuming those are skateboarders. Excellent. Wonderful. Any other suggestions how this could benefit other populations? Someone with a broken leg, someone using a walker. Excellent. Wonderful. Okay, these are great ideas. Excellent and insightful suggestions. So if this kind of topic intrigues you, I strongly suggest you check out Don Norman's The Design of Everyday Things and Lidwell's Universal Principles of Design. But wait, there's more. Like the curb cut, closed captions were originally created for people with hearing impairments, folks who still use closed captions to this day, and thus only intended for a limited user group. Turns out the closed captions help all kinds of people and represent a much larger user group. Today, closed captions are used by people who watch videos in noisy environments, foreign viewers who read translated spoken content in different languages, and English language learners too. But let's take captions a step further. Have you ever considered turning on the closed captions when a young one is watching TV? Imagine an everyday tool that allows new readers to begin to associate the written and spoken word visually and orally. I did this very thing with my daughter, Rachel. She quickly became a voracious reader, bedroom overflowing with books, always working on writing something of her own. And last month, she graduated from the MS Diet program with her master's degree. Your results may vary. Now let's look at closed captioning a third and final way, namely as transcripts. Media-rich courses chock full of videos are desirable, right? Take that stuffy old lecture, turn it into a little movie. Sounds great. But what if the learner wants to search that content of that video lecture? What are their options? Video annotation tools aside, you can't really search a video for the key term ornithology. This leads us back to closed captioning. By providing a transcript below the video, ostensibly for folks with hearing or seeing issues, or for speech to text, some learners, the video now becomes searchable. Learning resources vastly expand the power and the content of the delivery method. So to recap, in case you didn't catch it the first 7 times, accessibility is just good design. Accessibility design often has unexpected and significant benefits. To take this idea to the next level, we have Dr. Cassandra Kelley showing us the power of choice offered by multimodal delivery methods. Cassandra?
Thank you. So hello again to everyone. The section of our presentation that I will be discussing today is the power of choice for educators and for learners. I want to preface that ultimately it's up to you to determine what works best for both, and it might change depending on the learning objective. So that's one of the beauties of having options. Next slide, please. Before we dive into some of those choices that are available, I want to take a moment and reflect on the importance of mindset. Please read the quote below. And maybe I can bug Janine. Would you like to read it out loud for us?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Shifting my mindset is not something that always comes naturally. We need to remind ourselves and challenge ourselves to think in a different way.
I appreciate you reading that. Hopefully this is a helpful reminder for all of us that sometimes when we are exploring new choices that might involve shifting our mindset and being open to learning something new. Okay, next slide, please.
That's on me, just a moment.
That's okay. We're still shifting our mindset here, so it takes time. And so as Dr. Arnold mentioned, the section about choices is looking specifically at multimodal choices, multimodal options or formats of instruction. So I want to just highlight why this is important. As we know from research and from our life experiences, we don't all learn the same way. Learning takes many forms and one size doesn't fit all. So it's important that we want to think about how we can keep it engaging and how we can consider how knowledge is constructed. So when it comes to planning intentional design, it's critical that we incorporate elements of accessibility, which Dr. Arnold emphasized, and also to offer options to support all of our learners. Next slide, please. As educators, instructors, facilitators, designers, or whatever title role that you play in the process, the primary goal should be on taking a learner-centered approach, which means thinking about your target audience, the learner, who are we designing the instruction for, and focusing on their specific needs or interests while accounting for their prior knowledge and their background experiences that impact their understanding. So instead of acting like a traditional sage on the stage, the learner should be empowered to take ownership in an active role while we facilitate the instruction as a guide on the side. That means ensuring that the learners have metacognitive awareness, thinking about how they learn best, thinking about their time management and how they process information, their preferences for how they want to learn, and then also instilling the value of a growth mindset so that it's okay to make mistakes and to grow. Additionally, we want to begin to offer choices in the modality in which we allow them to then decide what's going to work best for them and how they want to demonstrate their learning. So some of those choices might include offering them the time or the scheduling of when they want to learn, how they want to learn, where they want to learn. Especially when you think about online instruction where mobile learning is ubiquitous and it can happen anywhere, anytime. And then giving a variety of formats for how the content's presented and for how they are assessed. Next slide, please. So moving at the role of the instructor, we can also think about choices that are comfortable, convenient, and beneficial with regard to instructional design and development and facilitating instruction. So that means deciding what technology tools will best support the content and the learners, which my colleague, Dr. Peterson, will discuss further in our next session. A lot of the tools that are available also offer options for how we, as the instructor, will engage the learner, communicate with them, offer feedback, and evaluate overall learning. And so one example is when you think about assessment and a lot of the technology tools today, how they can provide instant feedback in the role that the instructor might not have even had to do because it's so instant. And then the instructor can then go dive deeper into giving feedback based on what they take from the data collected from the tool. So it's kind of a neat win that some of the things that you would have had to do traditionally with paper pencil format can now be done with some of these tools. Next slide, please. So diving deeper into the choices for multimodal instruction, let's begin with a quick review of the format options. First, there's the traditional method of teaching in a brick and mortar setting where there's opportunities to directly interact with learners in person. And then next, there's online instruction where the learning extends outside of a geographic boundary. So this can include doing things with mobile devices or computers or different learning management systems. And then both of those can have elements of synchronous and asynchronous learning, which I will expand upon shortly. And then finally, there's the idea of merging both formats together in a blended learning format. And sometimes you might hear this referred to as hybrid learning. So hybrid or blended learning obviously incorporates elements of both, and there can be advantages and disadvantages to each of these formats, which is again why it's important to consider choices and weigh this out based on the learning objectives. I also want to bring to your attention the idea that sometimes when we think about bringing in the technology, we get a little distracted or too focused on the tools themselves. And that's why, again, it should always be about the instruction. So I love this quote to the right, that instruction should be the focus, or the instruction should always focus on andragogy and pedagogy and learner engagement rather than on the technology. So that's what's key always. Next slide, please. This image represents one of the key ideas in our three themes, that adaptation is not replication. And it's here as a reminder that moving traditional face-to-face instruction into an online or even blended model doesn't mean just transferring the content to a website. There's specific methodologies that should be considered while also determining what technology best supports the learners and goals. So for example, having learners type something that would normally be handwritten in a journal and then having them put it into this, online setting isn't necessarily utilizing technology to a higher degree. That's why we want to be intentional about the choice to leverage tools that promote critical thinking and collaboration. So for instance, changing the medium where the learners are publishing something typed online into a space where there's a real audience that can provide feedback, like in a wiki or a blog, where there can be comments and knowledge shared, is an opportunity where that for their collaboration can happen. And then, there might be opportunities where experts can be accessed globally to investigate a problem, and that might not be possible in a traditional classroom. So this is where authentic assessments become important as we think about the technology and the format. And again, Dr. Peterson is going to discuss this further in her section. Next slide, please. So I talked about it a little bit earlier, is the idea that all methods of instruction can include elements of synchronous and asynchronous learning. So when you think of asynchronous, you think of the learning that's independent outside of the time where it's live, and synchronous is in real time. So for instance, in a traditional brick and mortar classroom, there could be activities that require learners to work together and discuss content. And then there can be activities done outside, which later connect back to the classroom. Similarly, this can be done in an online learning where content's front loaded. There can be materials that the learner can go through prior to a live session or following a live session, pre and post assessments. And then in synchronous sessions, that's when the instructor can bring the learners together for interactive discussions, to exchange perspectives, problem solving, participate in community building, etc. So for each of these, it's important that the instructor asks, for what learning activities does being together make a difference? And then consider how to bracket some of the live sessions with those asynchronous activities that can be done outside of when they're together. So it's important, again, to really consider that over, online versus in person. Next slide, please. And so this is my last slide. I just want to kind of review that when you're making a choice for each of the formats mentioned, it's helpful to think about some of the affordances or benefits of each. Sometimes it makes sense to explore a blended approach and bringing in some elements of online learning. And in other instances, face-to-face may still work best. Even now, when we reflect on how online learning occurred, especially in K-12 during the pandemic, and in some cases it's still occurring, we know that a lot of us, including young children, experienced like a Zoom overload. So it's about balance and not necessarily having all live sessions or having all asynchronous independent activities, but finding that fine balance between it all. And that's the beauty of being open to choice. So this slide is just to emphasize some things that you might want to consider that are beneficial for online learning or blended. It can be cost efficient because you don't necessarily need a physical building or classroom space, and it does offer that increased flexibility and mobility. The learners can be given many choices for accessing and engaging the content. And when designing the instruction for this, it's necessary to think about the technology needs of the learner. That can include their comfort with technology or their confidence, the options for accessibility to make sure that they can actually access everything, thinking about the bandwidth speed, download time. And so, there's a lot to consider. And then the fact that if it is solely online instruction, you want to still build a community. So I really like this quote to the right about, in the absence of a physical classroom, an architecture of engagement must be intentionally created. So that's just something also to keep in mind while keeping it learner-centered, is to build that community so that they don't feel isolated. So either way, online blended learning isn't necessarily better. It's just a choice to consider. And these are some of the things that might be beneficial. And so if we can go to our next slide, just to recap. So we've discussed accessibility and the power of choice. And now Dr. Peterson is going to talk a little bit more about how adaptation is not replication. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kelley. So I'd like to dig into this idea of adaptation is not replication a little bit more. So instructional designers are, just like the name sounds, they're people who are designing the instruction. And most naturally, that's usually a teacher, instructor, trainer, but it can also be an individual position. So there are people out there that all they do is help design the instruction for someone else to deliver it. And so I just wanted to make that distinction that oftentimes teachers are also the instructional designer of the learning experience, but sometimes that teacher partners up with an instructional designer to help shape that experience. So instructional designers are not simply repeating what's happening in a face-to-face synchronous classroom. As Dr. Kelley mentioned, the idea of choice plays a really important role in educational and instructional design. There are myriad choices to be made with the design of any learning experience. And to help instructional designers and educational technologists make these choices, there's a mindset and a set of frameworks that help guide them. So let's start by taking a look at the mindset. You can move. Thank you. So the mindset of educational technologists is called a missional thinking mindset. And you may not have heard this term before. If we can move to the next slide. Missional thinking is a mindset that identifies the learning goal and keeps it at the forefront of all of the design decisions. This mindset is contrasted with something called instrumental thinking, which focuses on the technology, and that chosen technology drives the conversation. Both of these mindsets deal with how you envision technology assisting the teaching and learning. But missional thinking is more effective at achieving the intended outcomes because missional thinking drives the questions we ask and it puts the educational goals first. You can move to the next slide. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of instrumental versus missional thinking. In this first example, the colleague says, hey, Ms. Technology Director, we just won this grant. What cool technology should we get for our school? That is an instrumental thinking mindset because they're thinking about the technology first, not the learning goals first. The way you could kind of transform this statement is, hey, Ms. Technology Director, our students are struggling in applying math concepts to real-world situations. How can we help them? The second example, you've got someone saying, hey, Mr. Technology Director, what can we do to encourage our teachers to use more technology? Again, you can see this is a very technology-centric question. If we're to revise this and switch it to more of a missional thinking mindset, we'd say, hey, Mr. Technology Director, I'm worried about student engagement in our classrooms. Can technology help? So you can see in both of those examples, we're putting the learning goal first and then thinking about how can technology be used in an effective way to help support that learning goal. You can move to the next slide. Another word about the learning goal. As I've mentioned, with missional thinking, you keep the learning goal in the forefront of your conversations and your decision-making. But that goal is the starting point of your design, not the entirety of the design. The design also needs a success indicator. How will you know that your learner has achieved that goal? Also, the design requires instruction and activities to support the learner in achieving the goal. So you not only need the goal, you also need these other pieces, the assessment or the success indicator and the instruction. All three are required for an effective design. We can move to the next slide. There's one more piece of important background that you will want to have before you're making your design decisions, and that's knowing who your learners are. You'll want to think very carefully about who your learners are and identify key attributes that might affect your design decisions. So you want to really hone in on, what is the background of your learners? What kind of prerequisite experience do they have? How old are they? What is likely kind of going on in their experience that might affect, either contribute to their learning or distract from their learning? How might the educational setting have an effect on the learning? Are your learners doing this? For example, if you're working with learners who are in a company and you're doing training, do your learners have to take this training outside of their regular work schedules? They're doing this kind of on their own time. Or do they have to fit it into their existing work schedule? Because those things are going to have an effect on how much focus that learner can place on their learning. If similarly, if you're working with students in K through 12, is this something that they're doing as an additional period in the day? Is this something that they're doing within part of the class? Are you carving out class time for this? So those are all considerations you have to take into account so that you can make design decisions that are going to take the situation that your learners are going to be in and use it effectively in the learning experience. You can move to the next one. Okay, so you've adopted your missional thinking mindset, you've identified your learning goal and your audience. So now you are ready to do some deep thinking about how technology can support and transform the learning experience. There are several frameworks that can help you think through these decisions. I'm only going to show you 3 today, and so as examples, but there are many others there that can also help you with your design decisions. Excuse me, the dry winter air is getting to me. So this first one is called the TPACK framework, and it identifies 3 forms of knowledge. The one in the blue circle there is content knowledge. So that's knowledge about the subject that you're teaching about. The yellow one is pedagogical knowledge. So this is your knowledge about teaching. And then the pink one is your technological knowledge. So that's your knowledge about how technology works. But as you look at this diagram, you'll notice that these 3 forms of knowledge are not entirely separate. They all have these areas of overlap. And these areas of overlap are critical because they represent deeper levels of understanding that you need to get to make effective design decisions. So if you think about it, there's that green section between content and pedagogical knowledge. That's indicating that there are certain pedagogical choices you can make that are particularly helpful in different content areas. So for example, you're not necessarily going to make the same teaching choices in a math class as you may say in a social studies class. Similarly, if you look at the purple section between technology and content, you may be using different technologies to teach different types of content. So this framework helps you think through those decisions around what are the best choices for the sum of the situations that I'm bringing together. In the center there's also the deepest level of understanding, which is where do all 3 of these areas overlap? So where is your sweet spot of making choices that help support the content, good pedagogical choices and good technology choices? Where do they all come together? So keep in mind that thinking about each one of these concepts individually, although it's useful, the key to using this framework is to understand how you teach them in a way that enhances students' experiences, and you do that by thinking about where that overlap is and how it affects the learning experience you're designing. So let's say, for example, you're delivering content to your students via your learning management system. So even if you have sufficient knowledge of the content that you're teaching and of your learning management system, you could still put together an entire course based on text-based PDFs, which would be very boring for students and probably wouldn't get to your learning outcomes. So you need to bring that concept knowledge and that technological knowledge and bring pedagogy into it. So that's kind of an overview of TPACK. Let's move to the next slide and we'll talk about another model. So this one is called the SAMR model. And this one is a particularly helpful model for teachers who are new to technology. So the SAMR model gives a teacher sort of an easy way to think about converting a lesson that they know might be effective into one that uses technology effectively. So as we kind of started this section, we talked about we're not looking at replication, we're looking at adaptation. The first level of SAMR, the substitution level, is really a bit of a replication type of approach to technology and pedagogy. And ultimately what you want a teacher to do is they may start at that S level, that substitution level, but eventually they'll develop into more sophisticated levels, kind of going down these blocks. But let me walk you through these 4 levels to give you an idea of how you can think about technology use in education. So substitution strategies, that green level, are the ones that save you time and space by cutting out what you would do on pen and paper. So some examples of substitution strategies are using online quizzes instead of doing them on paper in class, uploading a worksheet so that students can access it versus handing out photocopied worksheets. Or another one would be using a digital interactive whiteboard and saving that result so students can have access to it later. So those are all examples of substitution strategies, but you'll notice that substitution strategies don't change the learning process or the learning outcome. As we move into some of these other levels, that's where we look at really starting to transform the educational experience. So looking at augmentation strategies, that next level, in this level, technology adds something to the learning process beyond just being convenient. So augmentation might give your students a clearer understanding of a complex topic, or it might make that topic engaging in a way that traditional face-to-face pen and paper types of methods can't. So examples of augmentation are having the students use the internet to independently research a topic as opposed to relying on the teacher's lecture. Supplementing teacher instruction with a video that clarifies a particularly hard to explain concept. So you may be able to find a video that uses animation to really explain an idea that would be difficult to explain in a clear way on sort of audio description alone. The third level, modification, uses technology to design interactive and dynamic tasks that go beyond the limits of the traditional classroom. So at this level, technology can allow students to generate more inspired and innovative work that isn't sort of limited to being on paper. So an example of this would be having students produce a podcast to summarize a topic, or having them use a technological tool that takes something very abstract and makes it very visible. A couple of examples of this would be using Google Earth to help understand geography, or to use graphing software to help students understand mathematical equations. The last level, that redefinition level, is a level where the students are going to be able to engage in entirely new learning opportunities that would not be possible in that traditional classroom. So this would be things like connecting your students with other people around the world. This can be having your students publish their work online where they can get feedback from peers, or simply be sharing it with a broader community. Or you could have students experimenting with tasks that are, as Brian mentioned at the very front end of this, multimodal from a media perspective. So having them create, short films or web pages, so bringing together different types of media. One thing I do want to mention at all of these levels is, well, actually, let me state this about redefinition first. Redefinition does not necessarily mean that it is high tech. It means that technology is used in a meaningful way to give new opportunities for student learning, regardless of how sophisticated the technology is. So I just want to kind of note that as Dr. Kelley had said earlier, it's the choice is not always a choice to choose technology. Those choices need to be carefully made, and you really want to choose technology in ways that kind of get to these higher levels of this SAMR model, where you're really extending the learning and augmenting the learning versus using technology for technology's sake. So if we go to the next slide, this is the last example that I wanted to share with you. So this is the technology integration matrix. It's another framework that is helpful because it provides a common vocabulary for discussing how technology can be integrated and how to help support teachers in effective use of technology. So like SAMR, the technology integration matrix recognizes that educators develop their skills and their proficiency in teaching technology. So what you see on the sort of horizontal axis there going across the top is the levels of technology integration. So you're kind of expecting your educators to develop across these levels of integration. And then you can use this matrix to provide a framework for how you are running your school or running your training program, because you can see how your teachers or trainers are developing in their use of technology. You can also, along the vertical axis here, are these 5 different research-based practices on how to use technology effectively in a pedagogical way. So each layer there helps guide teachers in terms of how they can be using those pedagogical practices and how they can get more sophisticated in their development of each one of those practices using technology. Yes, I agree. The matrix is difficult to read. It's pretty tiny on the screen. We will be providing a copy of the slides afterwards, and you'll be able to see it better that way. You're welcome, Carol. So you can use this technology matrix as a guiding framework for technology investment to help figure out as an institution, where do you want to spend your money from a technology perspective. You can also use it as a framework for targeting teachers' professional development and helping educators understand where they might need mentoring. So one of the things I really like about this matrix is it helps you plan the support of teachers in a pretty strategic way, and a way that helps kind of customize your approach to their needs. So the Technology Integration Matrix, SAMR, and TPAC are just 3 of many frameworks that help educators and administrators guide their decision-making and structure their thinking about learning design. And we can go forward to the next one. So we've talked a bit about these 3 themes of that design mindset, and we would like to go ahead and open it up for questions.
And if you want to, I think they can raise their hand, right? If you want to talk, we can allow you to talk if you just put your name in the chat if you want to speak. If the text is a bit difficult for you.
We've answered all the questions. All right.
Oh, you all really did. That's great. It does look like we have one person who's raising their hand. So thank you. Yes, Carol, you can unmute yourself